Hi, welcome to Hardware Basics Chapter 1, taking a computer apart and putting it back together. Every IT technician should know how to take a computer apart and put it back together again. The following slides will cover this. Alright, so when you're planning and organising your work, make notes for backtracking. Which piece went where. Remove loose jewellery that might get caught. Stay organised by keeping small parts in one place, and never ever touch the inside of a turned on computer. Okay, so consider the monitor and the power supply as black boxes. Never remove the cover and touch inside. Don't stick a screwdriver inside them. They do hold a charge enough to kill you, so I wouldn't be pulling those items apart. It's fine to detach a power supply from the case, but I wouldn't pull the power supply itself apart. Do not touch board chips with your hands or a magnetized screwdriver. Magnets are bad for computers, static is bad for computers. Don't put your fingerprints on the edge of connectors, may cause corrosion. Watch out for sharp edges that can cut. So when you're working inside the computer, you don't want to end up with a nasty scratch. When you do pull boards out, do not stack them on top of each other. Alright, so essential tools. ESD strap, right? Electrostatic discharge, which is one of these lovely things here that we supply in class. A flathead screwdriver, a Phillips screwdriver, perhaps a Torx screwdriver set, insulated tweezers, OS, operating system, a recovery USB or DVD, and there's lots of tools you can use, but with your tools take care and keep them in a toolbox so you have them all in the one place. A computer case for any type of computer is sometimes called a chassis. It houses the power supply, the motherboard, the processor, memory modules, expansion cards, and hard drives and other drives like SSD. And here's some memory modules here. Alright, so it can be a tower case, a desktop case, all in one case, or mobile. Loopback plugs. Okay, so these are used to test a network port to ensure that it's working correctly, and you can also test the throughput or speed of a port. So when you open a case, make sure that you back up important data, power down the system and unplug it. Unplug the peripherals as well, like a printer. Press and hold the power button for 3 seconds. This is to discharge the power that's left in the circuits. Maybe a little bit more than that, but you'll see the hard drive light come on as you're holding it down, and once that light goes away, it's completely discharged. Have a plastic bag or a cup handy to hold screws, or you might like to set them down exactly where they came from on a piece of paper and write down and label them. Whatever your style, as long as it works. Open the case cover. So some cases require you to remove the faceplate first, the front of the computer, but usually it's just remove the side panel. So then you'll need to locate screws or clips that hold the side panel on in place and remove them. Also deciding which side panel to remove. So as it's noted here, on this side of the case, the motherboard is mounted, so there's not much that you're going to be able to do there. So you would probably want to remove this side of the case. On here, you might notice that there's thumb screws here. So these thumb screws are raised out, and they have indenting like a coin, little grooves like the side of an average coin, so you can grip onto it and twist them with your fingers and your thumb. This case here has screws that you can't remove with your thumb, so you'll need a traditional screwdriver. This one here has clips, and this is actually a picture of a DC7900, and this one has a release mechanism. You lift it up and push back. Alright, so once you have it open, clip your ESD strap to the side of the computer case, connect it to metal, works best. After opening, you will see main components like a power supply, the motherboard, and drives. If you follow the cables from the motherboard to the component, or from the component to wherever it goes, you'll understand what those cables are used for. For example, power cables coming from a drive. Well, look, normally in this case with the DC7900s, they will be have wires yellow, black, and red, and they will go back to the power supply, and you'll know that that's power. So the other one connected, you'll find that it will lead to the motherboard, and that is for data. So that's how to tell the difference. Inside the computer, the processor here is underneath this fan. Don't forget the processors get very hot. There's a heat sink and then a fan on top. The heat sink acts like a radiator, like in your car. These are the memory slots. Your motherboard is all here. It's not just that MSI logo. SATA data cables, SATA connections. I'll show you a better picture of that later. Here's an optical drive, also known as a DVD or CD drive. This is the front faceplate of the case. And here's two hard drive slots. Power supply, and the power cords running from the power supply. Alright, so all hardware components are either located on the motherboard or directly or indirectly connected to it, because they must all communicate with the CPU. So as you'll notice, a hard drive isn't located on the motherboard, although in the case of NVMe SSDs, they will be directly connected to a motherboard. I don't have a picture here, but as you'll see down here, here are the SATA connectors. So if you find something running from your hard drive to one of these SATA connectors on the motherboard, that is for data. And here is our 24-pin power connector that goes directly to the motherboard. So easiest way to know what is the power to the motherboard, it is the biggest connector on your power supply. And now we have our PCIe slots, and this is ×1, that's ×16, and there's a PCI slot. Sorry, PCI slot there. CPU cooler, 4 DIMMs, dual inline memory modules, and this heatsink here is for the chipset, but we'll talk about the chipset later. Main components installed in the case: motherboard, processor, and cooler. The motherboard is also called the main board, the system board, or a MOBO. Contains a socket to hold the processor, which is the CPU, which you can see here, a picture of that, and we'll go into the different connectors with those a bit later. The CPU, or processor, processes data and instructions for the entire system, generates a lot of heat, so you'll need your heatsink and fan. or perhaps liquid cooling. So a heatsink, a fan and a heatsink together are called a processor cooler. Alright, expansion cards, also known as adapter cards, are a circuit board that provides more ports than those provided by the motherboard. So in modern motherboards today, you will find that they actually have a lot of different connections. But a long time ago, you might just have one or two connectors, and then if you want to connect to a network, you'll need a NIC, network interface card. And if you wanted to use a monitor, you'd need a graphics card. And if you wanted to use sound, you'd actually have a sound card. The old sound blasters. I'm sure I've got some in the lab somewhere that I could show you if you'd like to ask me about that. Alright, so memory modules. Random access memory. It's temporary storage for data, right? And instructions as they're being processed for the CPU. And dual inline memory module slots hold the memory modules in place on the motherboard. Now, RAM is volatile memory. So when you turn the computer off, everything disappears. It needs constant power. While non-volatile memory, like your hard drive, will permanently store that data even though it's on there or not, until you erase it and replace it with something else. Alright, so it says here, easiest way to identify a video card is to look at the ports. So here's your DVI port. This is really old school TV out connector. I think it was also called S-Video, if I'm not wrong. And this is a 15-pin analog video port, also known as a VGA port. This adapter comes in PCI Express. This is a tab used to hold the card in place, and you'll have to release it with a little clip. There's a heatsink there to keep it cool. Graphics cards also get quite hot because on the graphics card you have something called a GPU, graphics processing unit. And the difference between your CPU and your GPU is your CPU is doing many different things all at once, multitasking, and your GPU is just churning through data. And that's why it's used for Bitcoin mining, because it's focusing on the task rather than having multiple different things that it's doing. A DIMM holds the RAM and is mounted onto the motherboard. Okay, so you've got your dual inline memory module, and these are the DIMM sockets and your RAM chips on there. Hard drives may also be called hard disk drive, HDD, is permanent storage used to hold data and programs. All drives in the system are installed in a stack of drive bays on the front of the case, or it might be down the bottom, depending on your case. So here we have a metallic spinning disc, magnetic disc, and this, what you would be using would be SATA 3 at this stage. Then you've got a SSD, a solid state drive, and from what I can see here it's connected via SATA, so it is slower than your NVMe M.2 SSDs. And this is an optical drive or a DVD drive. Reason why it's called an optical drive is because it's using a laser. Alright, opening the case. The power supply, also known as power supply unit or PSU, and you'll find that I'll be referring to it as a PSU, receives and converts current, house current, so that components in the case can use it. There is a voltage selector, but we don't want to be playing with that, just for different regions. And you'll see all of the power cables here. And actually, interesting thing, this is a more modern power supply unit that you'll be playing with, and it's actually got a covering over the top of the wires to make it look a bit neater. And you'll see here, this is a release clip for a hard drive bay. Alright, so different form factors, standards that describe the size, shape, screw hole positions, and major features of a computer case. Right, so your case, if you have a very large case, it will have screw holes to house all of these, but the main types, the main form factors that we use are ATX and micro ATX. So ATX stands for Advanced Technology Extended. Most commonly used form factor today. It was originally developed by Intel. It is open, non-proprietary industry specification. Okay, so everybody can use it because it's non-proprietary, and that's a good thing because then everybody can work to the same standard. Alright, and the power supply has a variety of connectors, the major one being the 24-pin P1 connector, which is for your motherboard, but these days a lot of the power supplies are modular, so you can get any type of connectors that you wish instead of being stuck with the ones that originally come with the power supply unit. Micro ATX is a major variation of ATX. It reduces the cost by reducing the number of expansion slots, reducing the power supply to the board, and allowing for a smaller size case, more compact case, small form factor. And as long as you're happy with the amount of as long as you're happy with the amount of connectors and expansion slots on that smaller motherboard, then go for it. To remove expansion cards, remove any wire or cable connected. So with your graphics card, you'll probably have a power cable connected to it. Remove the screw holding the card to the case. So you'll notice these little screws here on the side. They hold them down. You may actually have a clip that holds a whole bay down. In yours, grasp the card with both hands and remove it by lifting it straight up. You could also gently rock it a little bit side to side. Don't put your fingers on the edge connectors or touch a chip. And it's best to store cards in an anti-static bag. Alright, to remove the motherboard, make a diagram. Okay, you want a plan of how to put it back together. You won't always remember everything, and you don't really want to be sitting there scratching your head going, why have I got this leftover part? Okay, unplug power supply lines, unplug SATA cables. There's power supply, there's SATA cable. Disconnect any other cables or wires connected to the motherboard. Remove the drives and or power supply if required. So sometimes you can just simply remove the motherboard, and other times the way the case is, the power supply unit sits over the top of the motherboard and you can't get the motherboard past without removing the power supply unit. Remove screws that hold the motherboard to the case and spacers, little standoffs, and then your motherboard should be free to remove from the case. Remove carefully using an anti-static bag. Alright, firmware. Firmware programs and data stored on the motherboard consists of the basic, of the older basic input-output system, BIOS, firmware, and the newer Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, UEFI. Okay, so, and yes, it will be referred to BIOS /UEFI. Now these are the differences. BIOS was very simple in look, okay, and then your UEFI will look a lot more modern. That's not the only difference. There's actually security issues with BIOS, and so we upgraded to UEFI to get away from that, to fix that issue, remedy that issue. That's what I'm looking for, remedy. Okay, so post power on self-test. This is performed at the startup by your BIOS or UEFI. If you have a problem that prevents the computer from booting and you suspect it is related to hardware, install a postcard in the expansion slot on the motherboard, and this card monitors the boot process and reports errors. To remove the power supply from the case, look for screws that attach the power supply to the case. Do not remove screws that hold power supply housing together. Do not take apart. Sometimes power supplies are also attached to case on the underside by recessed slots. You may have a release clip, and there may be a certain way that you slide the power supply out. And that's also the same with hard drive bays and optical drive bays. There may be only one way you can slide it out once you release the clip. Using a power supply tester. You can use it to test the output of each power connector on the power supply and make sure it's working. See, so as we're going through the computer, you want to use a process of elimination. Okay, do I have a motherboard issue? Has the motherboard died? Has the power supply unit died? What sort of beeps is it making? All sorts of things, but as we go through each week, we'll get into this more and more. Alright, so this is a digital multimeter. Can be set to measure voltage, resistance and continuity. Now we do have some of these in the hardware lab and you can have a look at it. This is not really a certificate 3 level type of thing, so I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but you could test end to end from one part to another to see whether an individual chip on the motherboard has failed, and therefore stop yourself from having to replace the motherboard and replace a chip with, and this is more electronics, a soldering iron, and removing that and buying a chip and replacing it. Now I actually saw a YouTube video recently where there was this guy that bought a whole heap of old, they're not that old, Nintendo Switches, and they were broken, and he got them fairly cheaply, and quite a lot of them were water damaged and some other I can't really remember what other issues, but I definitely remember water damaged. And he was actually pulling them apart and using the multimeter to test the different chips, and then he was purchasing the particular chips that he needed and then installing them on the switches, getting them working again, and then selling them and making a profit. So if you, and look, you're here for IT, but if you do decide that you want to go further and to learn more different things, it could be quite profitable. But I'll leave that up to you. Some people's heads might be hurting now when I've gone into that already in Cert 3. Don't worry, this won't be on a test. A drive receives power by a power cable from the power supply and communicates instructions and data through the cable attached to the motherboard. Okay, so again, the difference between data and power. Now I hope you remember from when I said before, but to look, so this is a hard drive, this is a SATA, power connection. Mario, annoying me again. It's Sunday morning, leave me alone. Alright, so this one over here is a Molex connector, but I'll show you more of that later. This SATA power, if you follow this, if you're not sure, if you've forgotten, you follow that back to where it leads to from the hard drive, and you will find that it will go to the power supply. And once you know that one goes to the power supply, the other one must be data. But still, follow this one back, and I'm imagining it loops over like this because of our pictures. And there we go. Plugs onto the motherboard, that is data. Alright, tips to remove drives. Look for screws on each side of the drive, attaching the drive to the drive bay. Some drive bays have a clipping mechanism to hold the drive in place. There's a little clip there. You'll have to release the clip to slide the drive out, whichever way it goes. Some cases have a removable bay for smaller hard drives. You could even have a dock. So some of our computers have a SATA 3 hard drive dock. Some you may have to actually remove the front to remove any drives. Alright, this is a removable hard drive bay, and then you remove the drives with a screwdriver. So that's a whole bay itself rather than just pulling out a drive. Alright, documentation for the front panel header connectors. Right, so little pins that stick up from the motherboard, headers, and then you will have to read the motherboard documentation, which will tell you which pins do what and where the particular pin is. So pin 1 starts here, pin 8 is there, and then once you work out the mapping, then you can take these, which will be labeled, and then you get the joy of plugging them in. Now, wouldn't it be great if it was just all in one and you could just plug it straight in? But they can be quite a bit of a pain to sort of get in there, especially if you've got big fat fingers like me. But there they are there. Alright, ports on the front of the computer case. You have your USB ports, and they will be different colors depending on the speed. These are white, so these are a bit of an old school machine, but generally USB 2.0 will be black, and USB 3 will be blue, and then you could have red for USB 3.1 or 3.2. So even faster, but consult your motherboard manual. Alright, your mission this week, if you wish to accept it, you should accept it, honestly. It's good for you. Complete the week 2 practical exercises, which will be done in class. Okay, come in, use our computers, break our computers, don't break your own, please. And complete chapter 1, quiz 1. Alright, so the quizzes aren't assessed, as I've said before, for hardware only. Operating systems, they are assessed. But the reason why we have these chapters in here is as you're reading the book, some of that information can get forgotten. So if you put this into practice, you can then do your revision with the quizzes, and it helps you to remember. And I would also recommend having an exercise book as you're reading, and a blank one, as you're going through the book itself and reading, to write down notes. and then it's easier to go through your notes than read the entire chapter again. So RAM equals random access memory. DIMM equals dual inline memory module. CPU equals central processing unit. Little tips like that. Alright, well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this. Bye.